Our objective this evening is for you to walk away and basically understand three kind of basic things. One, what we're trying to explain, and so we should make sure that your question gets raised. So that's my job, to open up the framing so that you feel that you're going to interject a question. Second thing that we want to come away with is each of these gentlemen have experience in this issue. This is an experienced group of guys about how they look at things and why they look at things and what things they might want to look at in the future. That would be the second thing. And the third is basically to kind of get an understanding and general discussion about how much of this world is already understood and how much of it is evolving, and you have to be kind of a smart learner, right? You can view it in different ways. You can say this is a 10-year-old technology. You can view it in the perspective that it's a very new technology. So there's enough questions that we can go. Fair enough? Okay. Gentlemen. So can we start, Joseph, and we'll just go this way at the beginning. So what got you into this field? What were the significant elements that you professionally were interested in getting involved?
So back in 2013, I was in law school, California Western School of Law in San Diego downtown. So Raphael, who's standing over there, is my law partner. And he actually introduced me to Bitcoin back then in 2013. He was trading it actively. And I thought it was obviously an extremely interesting technology. Fast forward 2017, probably mid-year, about August. And so I quit my job. I was working at a small boutique law firm downtown San Diego on Broadway, and I created the Crypto Lawyers LLP. And I asked Raphael to join me, who was a litigator, is a litigator, and I was also a litigator. And so we created the firm. And we built, we bought the domain, the Crypto Lawyers, for marketing. We named the firm the Crypto Lawyers. And since then, we've been helping people bring economic freedom to the world in various ways.
So you've been tracking the evolution of how crypto is being developed as a alternative payments mechanism, a currency of its sort. Is that roughly looking at legal implications around that?
Yes, I don't think there's been that many innovations since Bitcoin itself. I mean, the most innovation and movement you saw, in my opinion, is the 2017-2018 ICO craze of all those tokens that all those companies that instead of selling equity or traditional fundraising mechanism, they just issued tokens and sold those tokens. So that was the biggest innovation since Bitcoin.
So the connection point for those of you who are, I'm not going to do much of this, but at the beginning, tokenization of value and the notion of exchanging value, which is tokenized, meaning it's associated with something that may be a currency and maybe not, is a big part of the blockchain story. And so if you're coming into the field, you want to take a look at what is meant by tokenization of value. What is value defined as? What do they mean by a substitute token and how that is exchanged? Chris, can you answer the same?
Yeah, so I don't know if this thing is on. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes. Okay, so initially I was first informed about cryptocurrency back in 2012, or actually 2011. And in 2012, I started digging into it a little bit more, but I was busy with my first entrepreneurial endeavor doing film. And so I kind of discounted it, and then I came back to it at the end of 2012, and I was going to buy a mining rig because for me, I didn't have a lot of exposure to it. I'm not a computer scientist. I have a bio background. I have a degree in genetics. So, I mean, I understand complex systems, but I still don't have, I didn't have as much of an understanding from a technical perspective as to why this wasn't a scam. And so I said, you know what? $500-600, I can buy this little rig, plug it in, point it to the network, and it's supposed to make magic internet money. And that's usually where people's first point of entry is into something easy. It's through mining, because it seems pretty straightforward. Well, come to find out that mining is not necessarily very easy, but the thing that I found very intriguing was this machine that I decided to go buy and purchase, two weeks later, the price had doubled for the same machine. And I didn't understand why, so I started digging in. And so in 2013, I started really doing a lot of research, which there weren't a lot of options at that point to find information or good information. So I just decided to jump in and start going to events. So by 2014, I was attending conferences and really trying to cement myself within the industry. Because I looked at it as, this is a new and cutting edge technology that has similar power to that of the internet, right? Meaning, when I realized you couldn't shut Bitcoin off, per se, that much like the internet, you might be able to regulate it in certain places, but you're not going to be able to shut it down, ever. So it would break before it gets shut down. And when I saw that, I said, okay, growing up in the Bay Area and seeing what the internet did in the early 90s, I said, I'm not going to miss a second opportunity at a chance as something as big and life-changing for, on a humanitarian level, as big as what cryptocurrency could potentially offer. And to me, it seemed like a no-brainer. So that's when I decided, it was about 2014, end of 2014, that I decided to leave my career in the biotech and pharma industry and pursue one in cryptocurrency and blockchain through starting a consulting practice called Coinstructive.
So right now, you're seeing that we have several years of experience here, and we've made a distinction between two things, which I'll just fill in the coloring book here. The blockchain technology evolved into an application called Bitcoin, which is the first major application of blockchain technology, which had actually been developed historically some time ago, was Bitcoin. They are not the same thing. They are related, but there is the crypto world, which is the transaction activity that is associated with the exchange of value. And then there is the blockchain environment, which is associated with transactional activity and distributed ledger technology, what you understand as DLT. So we won't go into the specifics, but think of this world as having multiple dimensions. Crypto has had a significant evolution, so a lot of the discussion this evening is going to talk about that because it's the most evolved form right now of the blockchain. It gets the most press, both positive and negative. But the enterprise application of blockchain technology is around specific things related to transaction activity and then some other activity, which we'll also discuss this evening. Okay? Are we tracking so far? Okay. William.
All right, Bill Restis, Restis Law Firm. I got into, I guess I can call it Bitcoin, back in 2013 as a curiosity. It came on my radar when the price of Bitcoin spiked to a little over $1,000. And I had my first aha moment that this is some sort of magical internet money, as Chris said. And then very rapidly after that, the price crashed down to a few $100s, and I said to myself, well, I guess that's the end of Bitcoin, and that it was a failed monetary experiment. And I was very busy in my litigation practice at that time, and so it really kind of fell off my radar screen. In 2016, I took a sabbatical from a securities class action practice. After having a couple of good years, I was about to go crazy and I needed to unplug from the law for a while. And that was, again, when Bitcoin was beginning its ascent financially in the beginning of a major bull run. So when I didn't have anything professionally to work on, I just started to dive into this in a very... I was gorging myself on all things cryptocurrency and Bitcoin in particular. And then I was seeing the ICO craze happen in 2017 when I started my current firm. And I was saying to myself, this really seems like there's some securities law issues here. And these ICOs might be something like an IPO. Go figure that. And so I filed the first securities class action against the largest ICO at the time, the Tezos ICO. And I've been involved in a couple other cases since. So without going into too many details, I'll leave it at that. But that was how I caught the bug, so to speak.
So since we have a lot of emphasis initially on crypto, and we will get to smart contracts, one of the things we're going to discuss this evening is the concept of smart contracts. We call them exchange agreements, not formal contracts, and the term contracts has actually been confusing to many people in the business environment that at least I'm familiar with. So we will have that discussion for sure. But since we have a lot of experience in the crypto space, and because it's so heavily written about at this time, and the notion of whether it's going to be a regulated industry or follow a regulatory evolutionary curve, or whether it's going to still retain what the economist calls the Wild West, why don't we focus on that, and we'll get your questions involved. So, William, you've been involved in the litigation side. Where is the regulation now for this? And the question was, so we had some questions, and I've worked with all of the panelists to sort of identify areas that they feel that they want to make sure that you hear from them on. So this is a prioritized list, and at this point we'll start engaging everyone in questions. Okay, so now we've done initial statements. So this question that we gave was focused on a specific outcome of a regulatory space, but exchange disputes. How do you see this as resolving or enabling those disputes, I guess?
Sure. So there's litigation in the space, and there's a lot of things that we can fight over. I think one of the major topics right now is ICOs, and whether investors in ICOs in 2017, early 2018, have a right to unwind their investments into these unregistered offerings. So there's a lot of securities issues. That's one of the main topics that is a hot button issue for everybody in the space. If we can take a step back though, and really we have to ask some more fundamental questions. So one of the things that was going to be asked of me today was about a particular class action against Coinbase that dealt with Bitcoin that had been transferred out of Coinbase to an email address and was never claimed by the people that got it. That case had a confidential settlement, so I can't discuss, the resolution of it. But what that case addressed was some really very basic property issues. Because if you're talking about something like a Bitcoin, it's in its essence, it's a digital bearer asset, right? If I have it, a question becomes, do I own it? There's no deed to a Bitcoin per se. And so that case was really starting to deal with what are the property rights inherent in a digital asset like Bitcoin, and where the case was going before it was dismissed, was settled, is that traditional property laws can function to determine who owns their Bitcoin. So state property law is something that we were fighting over in that particular case. Litigation, also arises in the situation where somebody's cryptocurrency, and I'm just going to use that term really broadly because it almost has no meaning anymore because of the way it's been overused. But one of the other major issues with crypto is it gets stolen a lot. People, right? Everybody's shaking their head. Hopefully it hasn't happened to anybody in this room. But so there'll be issues like somebody has their crypto on an exchange like a Coinbase or a Kraken, and a hacker hacks into their phone or their email and is able to go to the exchange and remove their digital bearer assets, as I said. And so a lot of the issues in the litigation space right now are, is the exchange responsible? And when are they responsible? You'll notice too that when I talk, probably all of us, when we talk about these questions, there's more questions than answers. We were joking before we came in here that we kind of make it up as we go along because there's not a lot of settled law in this area. So that's a big issue. For me, one of the biggest upcoming topics in the next 12, perhaps 18 months is what are the obligations of exchanges that handle and transact and have custody of crypto assets. So, for example, in the securities world or in the commodities world, there's very detailed obligations that a broker must perform when it's handling somebody's investments. There are issues. So, for example, like if you were to go and trade your stocks, you would have a broker, your Schwab, and then your broker would send your trade that you wanted to execute off to an execution venue, and then you would have a transfer agent that would transfer the shares. Then you would have a different party who is a custodian of the assets. Well, in the crypto world, and all of these separation of roles are for very, I think, very beneficial purposes, that they protect investors and they make efficient markets. But in the crypto world, you have an entirely different dynamic. You have an exchange that is a broker, an exchange, a custodian, a transfer agent, and probably they're trading against their customers on the exchange. And so all of these separate roles have been conflated together into single entities. And it's very dangerous. It tends to result in money lost. So I think where we're really going to be moving is, what are the obligations of exchanges? And we're going to be seeing the space migrate towards best practices from the securities world. There's things like what type of a obligation does an exchange have to you to give you the best price for your trade? If you were to trade a stock or a bond, and stop me if I can be verbose, so just like go like this if I need to stop talking. So if you were to go to a broker or to an order execution venue, you have obligations of best execution. These parties are required to make sure that you have a good price for your trade, and there's a multiple layers of prophylactics that we can go into if anyone's interested about how that works. So I think that's one of the next big trends. And then money transmitter rules. And then one of the big issues too is arbitration. So arbitration specifically with respect to exchanges. In almost all contracts, consumer contracts, there's arbitration agreements and there's class action waivers, so that people like me, if there's a big hack, can't come in and say, you know what, this hack and all these people lost their cryptocurrency. They can band together and they can seek redress as a group. If a crypto exchange was regulated under the Securities and Exchange Act or the Commodities Exchange Act, Securities Exchange Act specifically, they wouldn't be allowed to have these arbitration agreements. So one of the issues that's coming down the pipe is, well, if you have an exchange that's trading something that might be a security or might be a commodity, can these types of agreements be enforceable in their contracts? And I can keep going. I'm going to stop talking and give these.
I actually wanted to add to what you were saying, or bring up an extra point, was you're not just seeing that the exchanges are having to kind of slowly to put one step in front of the other so they can try to figure out how to navigate this space without going to jail themselves, but then you also have regulators from a national level, at a state level, who are implementing their own voice so they can be heard and try to do their own versions of consumer protection. But in a case like Coinbase, who had to leave Hawaii because of some rules that the Department of Financial, I can't remember what it's called, it was from the state of Hawaii specifically. So they basically said, in order for you to operate here in Hawaii, you're going to need to also have the equivalent amount of dollars in the bank backing up all of those assets. Well, Bitcoin can go up 30% in a day. Where do you get 30% more dollars? Those are things that just don't make sense. But you have people writing law or passing amendments that are basically forcing people to follow rules that can't be followed because they don't understand.
So let's make sure that this is understood, right? So we have an exchange marketplace. You guys correct me if I go a little bit too far in either direction. But we have an exchange marketplace that is currently, let's call it, imperfectly regulated or non-regulated entirely. Because some of what you're saying says that the state authorities have actually come in and affected.
And the federal level too. I mean, they're trying to fit new things into old law.
So the thing that's being exchanged through this technology is called a digital asset. What's a digital asset, guys? What is that? What is it? Is it like a physical thing? I have an answer.
Digital assets are only represented in digital form. So
It can be pegged to a dollar. So you have stable coins, which it's a digital asset, but it's pegged to something that exists. So for example, 1-to-1 ratio dollar USDC, which is Coinbase version of a dollar. That's a stable coin. Facebook is talking about launching their own cryptocurrency, Libra. In my understanding, it's going to be a stable coin that's pegged to global currency. I don't really know. I haven't read the white paper, but it's supposed to be pegged to multiple currencies. So that's going to be interesting.
So it's a digital activity. This is all transaction, right? There's no bank, there's no trucks running around between digital exchanges exchanging coins, right? It's all done on computers. It's all done on a ledger-based technology so that people can observe that ledger. It's a cryptographically secure. Some people use the term immutable. Many of us in computer science don't like immutability as a term. In our world, nothing is immutable. Depends on how much you want to put against it. But in every world in the exchange, if you push against something hard enough, you can crack most security technologies, right? So this one is probably much more resistant to this. Those of you interested in having that discussion will do that.
To add something about exchanges too, that just from a very high level, in case people aren't familiar, but first off, there's two types of exchanges. There's the traditional type of exchange where you go in and you have different pairs against the dollar and other cryptocurrencies, and you can purchase them with dollars. But then there's some exchanges that only allow you to trade cryptocurrency for other cryptocurrency. So there's almost, right now, you have two different types of exchanges. And then from there, exchanges, when we were talking about immutability or using the blockchain to record those transactions in a transparent way, actually, most exchanges don't record anything on chain until the coins actually leave the system. So what are they actually doing behind the magic curtain? They have a Excel spreadsheet or some sort of MySQL database where it's your name and the number of coins that you own. And that's all it is. It's not really cryptocurrency when you're using an exchange. That's why it's really important when they say, not your keys, not your coins, which means if you don't hold the private keys, which is the ability to send that cryptocurrency, you don't really own it, which is why we get into this whole thing. Is an exchange a bank? How do you treat custodianship? And that's where this niche area is really boiling down to, is because it's very similar in a lot of ways to things that we're used to, but it also has a whole set of rules that we're not used to, and we're trying to figure out how to make that all fit.
Yeah, so it's an amazing discussion, because when you think about Bitcoin and you read the white paper and you kind of abide by the ideological or philosophical ideals, it's really a permissionless cryptocurrency. It's a permissionless currency that you can exchange from one person to another. It's peer-to-peer, it's decentralized, there's no third party. And so now, really the main way for anyone to buy cryptocurrency, unless you know someone that's willing to sell you, and so you trust that person, you meet that person face-to-face, is to go online and buy it from an exchange. And the key term here is custody, which has been, we've been talking about custodial, that's custody. Most exchanges have what's called custodial wallets, meaning that it's literally like a bank. You have the rights to trade and those assets are yours, digital assets are yours, but really you don't have physical ownership of them. Meaning that if the exchange gets hacked, or suddenly you become one of citizen of a country that they ban, the exchange can just disappear in a scam exit or any type of other exit, and you'll lose your cryptocurrency. And right now it's a big debate in the ecosystem, and so there's a lot of different exchanges that are being built that are called decentralized, and in short, that will allow you to trade peer-to-peer online, but while keeping custody of your funds. Those are called non-custodial exchanges.
So, and just to add a legal twist to that, one of the big dividing lines that regulators are coming out with between exchanges are the custodial exchanges and non-custodial exchanges. So just to use as a, so on the one hand, if you're a custodial exchange, you at least are a money transmitter. And how that would work is I send my Bitcoin to Chris. Chris is the exchange. Chris takes possession of it and then sends it to Joseph. Okay, that's a transmission of money under the Bank Secrecy Act.
And I take my piece.
And he takes his piece. The non-custodial exchanges are where Chris, as the exchange, offers Joseph and I a piece of software to interface with each other directly. And because Chris is not in the middle of the transaction, he's not a money transmitter in that context.
So Chris will be the blockchain, right? And so there's different blockchain. Ethereum is one of them. Bitcoin Cash is one of them that allow you to create those scripts where you have this on-chain escrow service. So Chris is an escrow on-chain service. The money is sent to him, and then once I pay you in dollars or whatever, the money is sent to me. And so it's an amazing way when you think about it to interact, to do a transaction between two parties that don't know each other. You don't need to know each other if you know that the transaction is going to be complete upon certain terms.
Okay, so what we're doing now is we're going to open this up to make sure that this discussion, which is around exchange marketplaces and this unique exchange of value and what we've just understood in terms of trends that you guys are seeing and some specific dimensions of that are understood. Then we're going to go to the question that the economists, for those of you who read it, focus on all the time, and they keep saying crypto is dead because of fraud. So we're going to have that discussion, and then we're going to move to smart contracts, which are exchange agreements, and what we mean by that and where that's evolving. Okay, so 3 more things coming, and thank you for telling us we weren't being clear, and I apologize for that. Okay, so to you, questions about this exchange, sir?
Yeah, so your definition of digital assets, if I understood correctly, has to do with a tying to a physical asset, or is it just ownership of some virtual token irrespective of whether there is some physical object tied to it?
Well, the definition I gave was to clarify that a digital asset can either be a cryptographic asset, meaning Bitcoin, Ethereum, or it can be in a way a cryptographic asset, but that's pegged to something that exists. So if you think about it, Bitcoin is kind of like the US dollar, right? It's we trust it because it's been there for 10 years. It has not been hacked. But then if you look at other digital assets like Tether, that's one of them that's tied to a dollar. So for every Tether, an existent Tether tokens or coins, there's a dollar in the bank somewhere offshore.
Okay, so for each digital asset, it's some virtual representation of what I own, and then you could have a system where that's also tied to a physical asset. And now my question would be is, what different jurisdictions inside of the states are currently honoring digital asset ownership and also its representation to a physical asset, if there is anything yet?
So I'll take a step back. I think that's a really good question. From a really fundamental standpoint, a cryptocurrency or a crypto asset is an accounting system. It is a revolution in the accounting system. If we go back to the Babylonians, we had single entry accounting where you would look at a book entry and it would say, Chris owes Bill $10. And then the Medicis in Italy in the 1400s came up with the double entry accounting system. Whoop, I went off there again. And that was a double entry accounting system. And that really revolutionized the exchange of value between parties. What Bitcoin did for the first time and what cryptocurrencies have done is create a triple entry accounting system. So the triple entry accounting system is the blockchain that is out there in the world being run on computers simultaneously worldwide. So for example, the third entry is not between Chris and myself. It's out there on the nodes, and either Chris or myself or someone else can come and look at that third entry, and that's where we get this concept of immutability. So that's where really the revolution of crypto assets come from. Now, in terms of what states allow you to denominate assets in this way, I can say now that most of them have come up with state laws that say that you can that an asset is not recognizable simply because it's on a blockchain, right? So and where that has been most prominently displayed is in the context of share ownership and equity and everything that comes along with, for example, if I own a corporation, there were rules, for example, in Delaware and other states that I couldn't put my shares on a blockchain. Well, the state legislators are going around and they're amending those rules. They're doing it not only with respect to cap tables and things like that for corporations, but they're doing it so that digital assets can be legally recognized as such.
What do you reckon about the idea that the issue with regulation in America is actually constitutional? So I come from a country that has a similar federated constitution, and we have this clause that basically defaults anything to do with interstate transfers to the federal government. So we don't have issues around property ownership between states, where it seems like you're running into a lot of issues that relate to state governments doing their own thing when cryptocurrency is essentially a borderless asset. What do you think about the idea that this needs to be something that transcends state boundaries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that is very interesting is there's a group called the Uniform Law Commission here in the United States who helps build template law so that states can look at adopting a technology or learn how to keep from stifling innovation before having to go ahead and attack a technology without understanding it, right? So, for instance, New York likes to jump the gun because they have a predominant foothold on economic policy for the US. So they made something called the BIT license. Well, in 2015, a handful of companies, majority of companies, could not comply with those rules, so they left, leaving all of the New York residents without the ability to utilize those services. So what you're seeing now is this template law that comes out is supposed to allow all of the states to have at least an even playing field so that as they adopt different versions, at least they have the same language, they understand the same terms, they're not coming up with their own definitions, and that so that things that are cross-border are not necessarily going to cause conflict, right? So that's my take on what the US is doing right now to try to eliminate those problems of having multiple versions by giving template law from the Uniform Law Commission.
So I think what you're talking about is really a question of jurisdiction, right? And that comes down to a question of what can a court do to manipulate an outcome, to unwind a transaction, to enforce a behavior. And while courts, either in the United States or in other countries, don't necessarily have jurisdiction over something that is a borderless asset. They do have jurisdiction over people and entities that are within their borders. So one of the ways that this is playing out, I can give you an example from the Tezos ICO. So, and without going into too much detail to make your head spin, the creators of the Tezos ICO recognized that, I think, that there were securities issues that were involved, right, with raising these funds in an ICO. So what did they do? They set up a Delaware corporation that owned the IP, and then they set up a Swiss foundation that was going to have the IP transferred to it, and then the Swiss foundation was going to be the issuer of the token once the ICO was completed. The Swiss foundation was going to take the Bitcoin and Ethereum that were invested in exchange for the Tezos tokens, and was going to take that money and then at the end of the day supervise the development of the ecosystem. So now what do you say? Where does that happen, right? Does it happen in Switzerland? Does it happen in the United States? And how Judge Seaborg in the Northern District of California, who is on this case, he came out with the first test, at least with respect to the securities laws. And what he said was, if the transaction, he took a test that if the transaction emanates and is settled within the United States, the courts in the United States have jurisdiction over the conduct. And what the judge said was, well, there's a lot of factors, and I won't go into what those factors are, but because the transfer of money from the investors to the foundation happened on the Bitcoin blockchain, and the Bitcoin nodes are all around the world, and they're predominantly in the United States, the judge said, well, we'll have jurisdiction because these transactions are being settled on the blockchain in the United States. The U.S. court has jurisdiction over that. So these are the types of questions that courts and regulators are grappling with.
Okay, so my name is William Dean. I would describe myself as a legal systems architect, and I have a background in computer science. They mentioned earlier about the idea of marrying the idea of property with a token. But the idea of property is a very old idea that predates the advent of telecommunications and software and tokens. So what about redefining property in a tokenized era, where essentially now you could virtualize property, where one person could own a wide breadth of tokens or not, and one person could own an array of assets or not. A token could be owned by multiple people. So by redefining property as this fluidic, virtualized thing, so people in computer science maybe know what virtualization means. It's the idea of taking one piece of software and running it on many different computers. If you virtualize property, that allows the blockchain people to circumvent ICOs, because now the idea of property itself is distributed in a way that I believe would be outside the thought processes of the Howey test and other sorts of regulatory bodies. I feel like if they fully adopt a distributed notion of property, lawyers who are thinking in those terms could provide a lot of value to the ICO community.
So was there a question in there? Okay, so that was a hypothesis. Have you guys run into the hypothesis on virtualizing everything?
I mean, I have probably a lot to say on this, but I don't want to take up the whole panel. But specifically, I think that almost, I'm not going to say every area of law, if we go out 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, legal concepts are going to change just dramatically. When you're talking about property law in the way that you just discussed, I don't think you can have that without a tokenized identity, right? So because as I said, let's say a Bitcoin, it's a bearer asset, right? So how do I tie that Bitcoin to myself? And there's really no way to do that unless you have a blockchain solution that we can say, I definitely know this is me, and we definitely know that that is you. There's companies in the space that are working very hard on that, and it's just one step in the chain of necessary events to come to that world that you're talking about.
So we have one topic. We're starting to push a little against time, so we said we would address the question of smart contracts here, and we want to spend a couple of minutes on that. So I'm going to turn it to Joseph, who's thought about smart contracts. Now, that is this notion that says that you can take a blockchain and you have a scripting ability through software that you can write an agreement that the parties in these networks can decide that they're going to do something, and that script language has in it the ability to basically complete a transaction between two parties or multi-parties. How's that going to change things? You have some ideas about this?
Well, I think on the legal side, and I'll be biased, I'll give an example for the company that I work with, Bitcoin.com. There is a service that actually anyone can use. It's free, and it doesn't have to be used on Bitcoin Cash. It can be used on other decentralized applications like Ethereum, where essentially you can notarize a document. So let's say you buy a piece of property, or you want to enter into a legal agreement. You can index that physical 10-page, 60-page legal agreement on a blockchain. In that case, the Bitcoin Cash, you would have a hash signature on that document, so that if anyone at a later time wants to argue about the authenticity of a signature, or if someone loses the actual agreement, that indexed agreement can be retrieved. Now, if you pair that with technologies like Ethereum or Bitcoin Cash, where you can have a transaction with an on-chain escrow, meaning that two parties are going to transact together. They can exchange, let's say, Bitcoin Cash for dollars. You have a legal agreement that governs that transaction. That legal agreement is already saved on the blockchain. The transactions will go through between two parties that have never met each other. And then, so the Bitcoin Cash will be transferred to an escrow on-chain, and then once that the seller receives the dollar from the buyer, he will authorize signing with his private key the escrow contract, and then the money that was held, the Bitcoin Cash or any other token that was held on the on-chain escrow, will be released to the seller. So essentially, you can have a sets of transactions that are completely decentralized. There's no need for third parties. In a way, like lawyers are going to need to adapt to that technology by being able to tailor agreements that can be adapted to transactions that take place on-chain. And that was, like, by the way, a really basic, rough, probably not super accurate description of how a blind escrow or smart contract escrow functions.
So let me give you a question, and this is for the panel. A typical thing that we address in the lab is a supply chain company that has hundreds of suppliers and hundreds of users, and they're interested in understanding whether blockchain technology can replace the current system of monitoring and administering simple things like I'm a construction company and I put an electrical power unit in a building I'm constructing that has warranty information associated with it. It has a service level agreement associated with it. It's got a whole bunch of paperwork associated with the characteristics of the performance of that and the cost of it and so forth and so on. Currently, that's a mixture of database technologies and manual processes, right? They have organizations devoted to that. Does blockchain help me in this respect? Is a blockchain an enabling technology that's going to help me administer supplier contracting?
I think I'll take that really quickly and guys can piggyback. Well, the principle of, and I think that probably the better issue is about decentralized ledger technology, not so much about smart contracts, because DLTs, blockchains, have the ability to provide a record of transaction that's completely immutable and accessible by anyone in the world. So if you want to keep track of things, that's like the perfect thing.
Yeah, but what if I'm a supplier and I don't want to let those other suppliers in my construction company know the prices I'm paying differentially on two different things that are related?
You have enterprise blockchain. So IBM Hyperledger, I just met someone that works with them. You have different type of enterprise blockchains that have private nodes, and so essentially the ledger, instead of being public like Bitcoin or Ethereum, it will be a private ledger.
So by that, it is meant that there's a technology called Hyperledger. It's associated with IBM. There's some competing technologies, have established architecture where blockchain handles part of the transactional activity, but that information is permissioned, meaning that you have, at the beginning of that, you set up a condition set for who sees what in that execution. So if you're interested in that part of this, there's an experiment underway with Maersk, which is a big shipping container company, using blockchain as an enabling technology for shipping, for ports and shipping transaction activity. Any comments from you guys on enterprise application spaces for smart contracts and technology?
One of the real problems with designing a system that you don't want other parties to also have on a public system that's very easy to see all the transactions and to not let people see those transactions. There are cryptographers who are working on things like zero knowledge proofs so that things can be verified without knowing the actual information inside of that transaction. So really important because, like you said, if you have a consortium of enterprise level companies all coming together to share a common database, well, if I can use what's called a block explorer to examine transactions for the last 3 months, well, I can predict what their quarterly profits, revenues, like everything that they're doing, if they're doing on a blockchain, I can have visibility to. Well, if I can front run, if I know the information, I can front run a market in the stocks, and I can short or I can go long, and I can make a lot of money doing that. So private blockchains are really great for a few things, but data integrity is not always the best because you're all relying on the individuals who have agreed to partake in that group or that consortium. They all agree on the same rules, but they can collude, they can change transactions. So it's still not a definitive, write it down, lock it on a blockchain, and it's there forever. So there is still drawbacks. We've got to remember blockchains are really just slow, expensive databases that we're still trying to figure out how to best utilize.
Okay, so we're pushing.
I'd like to just put a little legal twist on that. So I'm a little more bearish on the concept of smart contracts in the short term because the legal system that we have now, it doesn't allow us to take advantage of all the advantages inherent in a smart contract. So what a smart contract is intended to do is to make the outcome of a transaction be deterministic on something that is outside the party that I'm contracting with. Okay. So instead of Chris being able to determine that he's not going to pay me, or me being able to determine that I'm not going to deliver my widgets to Chris, some information out there is going to make that decision for us. Now, that might be a really useful means of exchange when we're talking about a global exchange. But when you're talking about domestic transactions, specifically within the United States, even though we can have a smart contract that says we're going to do X, Y, and Z, if he's still in the United States, I can still go to a court and make the court reverse that transaction or do something that goes beyond the deterministic level of what it's supposed to do. Because then it goes back to what we were talking about with respect to jurisdiction. Because even though we may have something that's out there that's immutable that we can't change, a court still has jurisdiction over the person or the entity, and unless and until our legal system changes dramatically, I don't think we're really going to be able to utilize these types of contracts. I think it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen in the next few years.
I think right now, it's up to the lawyers to put together contracts that take into considerations that a transaction may actually take place on the blockchain. And so we talked about arbitration clauses. You could have a contract that has an arbitration clause that says that if there's a dispute arising from that transaction that takes place on chain that's decided by that smart contract, then an arbitrator will be named, a physical person. That's a way to approach the problem right now.
Okay, so we're pushing against time. Is this quick? Okay, we're all going to hold him to it.
So just to be clear, smart contracts, from my understanding, from a computer science point of view, they're neither smart, they're neither contracts. Smarts means there's artificial intelligence. Contracts in the legal world means someone can be held liable and they can break the contract. Smart contracts are essentially programs that automatically enforce their execution. So in terms of if two people come to agreement that they agree to what the smart contract does, and that is their agreement, then how does the court go around the potential interpretation?
Well, I've never litigated one of these, but it really goes back to the way our law is structured, right? How are property laws construed? How are contractual arrangements construed by courts? And the way courts interpret transactions between people, they don't think the way the contracts, the programmatic execution of these things is different, and it's distinct from the way the legal system handles them. So there's I'm not going to say any, but a good litigator, a good person who represented a party to a smart contract that wanted to make it unenforceable or fight or whatever they wanted could certainly do that. And so what we really are talking about for these, to have a digitally native transactional system, we need to have a digitally native legal system, and we don't have that.
So that's a great point. Thank you for that, Bill. That's a great summary point on the conflict that the new technology is introducing to traditional ways that we've done things, right? And this is called the closing 1 minute, and then we're going to transition. Anybody want to take a guess? If you know the answer, because you're a computer scientist, don't answer this. But if you're coming into this space and you're trying to learn about this, anybody want to take a guess at how big, technically, the Bitcoin database is? How big is the Bitcoin database? All these transactions from the entire world of all of this stuff and so forth and so on. Anybody want to take a guess? How many think it's like really big? It's got to be. I'm at a supercomputer center. We deal with big things. How many? No, we're not going to end on that note. It's about 150 gigs. Why? If it is mirrored, it's 150 gigs on all of those nodes. That's right. Right. But what I'm saying is that there's a fundamental difference in the computational architecture of how this thing works, technically. And so the fact is that the databases and the core things are highly transaction activity, but they're small and they're all over the place. That's typically not how we've built databases for a very long time. A very long time. This is called a linked list technology, and any of you in computer science knows the first thing you learn in class, the first class, is the linked list is the lousiest thing on the planet for distributed information. And nevertheless, we're pursuing this because it's an interesting technology for business process interaction. And we focused on crypto, which is a exchange mechanism. So there's a big innovation curve going on in that area. The enterprise stuff is lagging for, I think, exactly the reason, William, you mentioned at the end, which is that we have a digital system that's trying to sit up on top of a business process activity that is still not fully digitized. Just call your local insurance company to understand that, or if you transacted any property transaction in the last couple of years, you also see it's a paper process. So this is the thing. And so I think it's actually, you said that you were bullish on this. I actually think it's a reasoned judgment that the smart contracts in the enterprise space are going to take some time.
That's what I said too.
Yeah. No, I'm reinforcing what you said. I'm just repeating what you said. Okay, so I think at this point we've unfortunately have to pull this to a close. I'd like to go on for another hour, but we have a main speaker and some other activities to take place. So I'd like to thank our panel very much. Thank you, guys. This is great.
Thanks, Jim. Thank everyone. So I think Chris is going to give a little background on Coinstructive and some of the blockchain legal education initiatives he is working on right now.
So you just heard me talk already, so I don't need to reintroduce myself. But one of the things that we didn't really get to talk about too much on the panel was the legal aspects of blockchain go hand in hand with the law enforcement aspects of utilizing blockchain, right? So I've been working with banking compliance professionals and law enforcement agents in and around this technology specifically, because just like lawyers, they also don't understand what they're dealing with, right? So it's really, I have a quick story to share with you. There's a case that recently wrapped up a couple months ago, or last month, from a gentleman that I knew through the San Diego Bitcoin meetup group. He would come to events. He was a young gentleman. He was selling Bitcoin as an unlicensed money transmitter. So he was an unlicensed money transmitter. He was living in Mexico, and he was coming back and forth across the border. So from a jurisdictional perspective, Homeland Security got involved. Right? Now, Section 5 of the Securities Exchange Act talks about not being able to send like securities and instruments of that nature through the mail. Well, he was also utilizing mail for some of his things, so the Postal Service was involved. Right? This became a federal case. And now this gentleman who I had done podcasts with, I'm sitting in a California financial crime investigators meeting, and that's half bankers and half law enforcement. And the presenter starts telling this story about this guy, and he goes across the border, and I go, "Excuse me, do you mean Josh?" And he goes, "Yeah, that's the guy." And I go, "Yeah, well, it's interesting because I know him from the other side of things." So to put the whole story together, I think it's really important for people to get educated from the ground up, because we're all trying to understand this from the same level and apply it to our industry specifically, right? So when I worked with the law enforcement and talked about this case, it was interesting to understand their perspective, and having talked with lawyers, it's interesting to understand their perspective. Same thing with banking compliance. You have these different groups coming together. One side's writing reports, one side's reading reports. Both of them don't necessarily know exactly what they're talking about, and until we get to that point, we need more education. So what has Coinstructive done? We have put together continuing education for business professionals in areas like banking compliance, law enforcement, and for lawyers. So on our website, it's available. You can go and you can sign up for classes. We offer continuing education credits. Currently in California, on the legal side, we're still applying for California State Bar. So I have to put that out there. But if anybody's interested and is looking to get some CLEs, or knows somebody in one of those types of organizations who's interested in about getting more education and can actually use it for their for their business or their industry, feel free to head to the website. You can use the code SDBLF, San Diego Blockchain Legal Forum, for 50% off any of the courses for the end of the year if you sign up before the end of July. So thank you, and hope to help educate more and more people.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. My name is Emilio. I am an attorney here in San Diego and a co-chair for the IEEE blockchain group. Thank you all so much for being out here tonight. It's truly exciting to see such an interesting mix of tech professionals, attorneys, crypto anarchists, and more. Thank you all so much. So our next speaker is an attorney. He's a partner for the law firm of Sheppard Mullin. He has been on the ground floor of crypto ever since it began to emerge as a disruptive tech. As a patent attorney, he understands how it works, and he's helped develop the key technologies for innovators in the space. But beyond that, he's advised companies in the regulatory matters and corporate matters, and he has over 35 years of experience in software and more. So without further ado, please welcome to the stage Jim Gatto. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So that was a great panel. A lot of interesting topics were covered. Some of what I have may touch on some of those a bit, so I'll try to avoid redundancy, but I think on some of them I'll kind of just touch on some aspects maybe that present some of it slightly differently. So just a little bit about my background here. I think the real key thing I wanted to say is that I've been doing software and technology work for about 35 years. Was a patent examiner, kind of evolved to doing everything IP, tech, regulatory, and transactional in the space. But really one of the things I've really focused on over my career is really trying to find areas where there's new technology, new business models, and not only deal with the IP issues, but there's always legal issues, and the law always lags behind innovative business and technology issues. And it's fun. I was joking with, I think, Will before. We were saying as lawyers, when you're early in the space, you really can't be wrong because there is no certainty in the law. You get to kind of make it up a little bit as you go along. I think he may have mentioned that. So it's kind of fun. So we've talked about currency, cryptocurrency, and blockchain technology as distinct things. We're going to cover them a little bit. When we think about currency, just taking a step back, really currency is just a medium of exchange. It's a way of doing a transaction, and it's a way of representing some form of value. And as we've looked over the years at how things have changed, and in the islands, people used to use seashells was a form of currency. And we've gone on to kind of printed money and coins, and then to electronic forms, whether it's credit cards or up through Bitcoin. And so the common denominator, even though these forms vary significantly, is they're all just a representation of value that permits a transaction to occur among willing parties. And so that's kind of, keep that in mind as kind of a key aspect of what currency is. So one of the things that people have a hard time wrapping their head around with respect to cryptocurrency is, and the people who are very bearish, they're like, well, cryptocurrency is worthless because there's nothing that backs it, right? And so quick true-false question, right? Is it true that cryptocurrency has no value because there's nothing backing it? Putting aside stable coins for a second, which we'll touch on. I mean, does anyone think that's a true statement? Good. And the corollary, the flip side is that fiat currencies they're more valuable because they're backed by governments. Does anyone believe that that's necessarily true? No. Look what's going on in Venezuela right now. We've seen other, currencies, fiat currencies that have gone to zero. And so that's not what drives the value of a currency, right? So if we look at the U.S. dollar, there's value there because you have to pay your taxes in U.S. dollars. And if I owe Dr. Short a debt, he has to accept U.S. dollars in payment for that. He can accept cryptocurrency if he's willing to do so, but I can't force him to take it. So that's the difference between fiat currency and other currencies. But when we think about, kind of just another level down of cryptocurrencies, and we talked just very briefly about tokens and tokenization of assets, I think it's important to really break down and look at the kind of the broader spectrum. So when you think about cryptocurrencies and tokens, they're really just digital representations, and they are ledger entries. There really is no physical token, right? And it is an accounting system. And just like when you go to Starbucks and you have a credit, you may get a card, but really the fact that you have $50 worth of credit, it's on a database in Starbucks database, centrally controlled. With cryptocurrency, it's just a different database. It's a distributed ledger or blockchain technology that's recording the transactions, and it's associating that representation of value typically with a wallet. And the wallet has an identifier, and what's stored is the association of that wallet identifier and the representation of value. So you can record these transactions on a database, call it blockchain or DLT or other database. And one of the things that's different with respect to crypto is that typically it's a distributed database. So you don't have a single entity that's controlling the database, validating the transactions, and holding the record. You have it distributed, as was mentioned. So those are some of the characteristics. When you look at crypto tokens, we go broadly beyond currency and now talk more broadly about tokens. Well, tokens can be a currency. They can be a form of currency. But where it gets really interesting is that crypto tokens can be a lot more, right? So crypto tokens can be programmed to have other features. And so some of the features that are referenced here is that a token can represent ownership. And we talked about digital assets, right? So token can be like title. So you think about title to a car, right? The title certificate is a paper token. Think about tokens can be like a digital analog to that, where if you have that title, it represents that you own the underlying asset represented in that document. It can represent access. So you think about digital tickets, for example. You could have a token that represents a right to go see a concert or some other event. You can have tokens that represent voting rights. And so you may have analogous to shares in a company. It could be voting rights in a project or anything else. But if you own that token, you may have some value or stake in that token in that project, but you may also have voting shares as a result of that token, if that's part of the way the token is designed. You can also have distribution rights, so you can have royalties or other things that flow to you. So, and there's other examples too. So tokens are really, I think, very interesting. The currency is fine as far as a digital form of payment, and having a global currency. There's a lot of benefits to that. The tokens are really interesting because you can do a lot more with them. And when we look at tokens, there's really two types of tokens from a high-level perspective. There's fungible tokens and non-fungible tokens. And the fungible tokens mean the tokens are essentially all the same. So you think about Bitcoin, one Bitcoin is the same as another Bitcoin. You really have no preference as to any particular one. It's like a dollar bill. They all spend the same. There's nothing really different about them. Whereas non-fungible tokens represent a unique asset. And I'll cover that in a second. And so just to give an example too of there's different, we talk about cryptocurrency, but there's really very many different types of currencies when we think about this. We think about Bitcoin, it's primarily just a currency, right? It's a representation of value. You think about Ether, it is a form of currency, and you can program other features and attributes in it. So it's more of a useful coin. There's a scripting language that works with it. And then you have, as was mentioned earlier, you have stable coins. So like the Gemini coin, for example, the Winklevoss brothers have gotten approval for, is an asset-backed coin. And so it is a currency that does have something behind it. And we'll talk about that more in a second. So just briefly to expand on fungible and non-fungible tokens, when you look at the characteristics I mentioned, you have this uniqueness. So what's interesting with non-fungible tokens is that typically it's like a title certificate, right? So you can have unique assets. So whether it's a digital piece of art or an in-game item in a crypto-based game or a game that has a crypto-based economy, you can have unique ownership represented by non-fungible tokens. And so there's a lot being done in both of those areas. And stable coins, I think, are getting a lot of attention because, as we've all seen, cryptocurrency prices have been very volatile. And because of that volatility, there's not a lot of people that are spending cryptocurrency on day-to-day transactions. The example is no one buys their coffee with Bitcoin. Because the prices, you don't want to, buy it today and have their price go up tomorrow and feel like you paid $10 for what should be just a $3 cup of coffee. So stablecoins are, it's a type of digital asset that typically has something that's backed behind it. And there's several different forms of this. So you can have it backed by fiat currency or other securities. You can have it tied to another cryptocurrency, or you can have it algorithmically backed. And what that means essentially is that there's algorithmic programs that will manage supply and demand in an effort to keep the currency pegged to some value, typically the US dollar or something else. So there's different types of currencies, and Tether was mentioned earlier is one that theoretically there's $1 for each Tether, $1 of Tether out there. That's come under question. Some activity about that. And there's other different forms of a stable coin, including most recently this week, Facebook announced their entry into the field with Libra, which is supposed to launch next year, and it's going to be an asset-backed stable coin that's going to be a basket of assets that essentially backs it. So just to kind of wrap up the currency piece, when you look at the difference between digital currency or cryptocurrency and traditional currency, you see that in the middle here, the common characteristics really of any currency is that first and foremost it's a medium of exchange. It's something that people agree to use as part of value transactions. And what makes it valuable is that it's commonly accepted, right? So there's a lot of people that did ICOs and create different cryptocurrencies. And if you go to deadcoins.com, you can see all the ones that have zero activity because they're not useful. But the ones that are still vibrant, it's because people either are using them or believe they will be useful in the future, probably more in the latter category. And a lot of people debate whether cryptocurrencies actually are a store of value. If you look at different events that have occurred when the Greek debt crisis occurred, you look at Venezuela, if you look at the number of transactions or the volume of transactions in those countries when these events occur, you see people are going to Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies as a kind of a flight to safety, and it's becoming, some people think like the new gold. Okay, so we talked a little bit about currency. Now we're going to talk about blockchain. Okay, I know this was covered a little bit earlier, but I'm going to kind of just give a high-level explanation. I know most of you probably know this, so I'll go through it relatively quickly. But as we mentioned, it's a form of distributed ledger technology. There's many types of blockchains, and so when we talk about blockchain, it's hard to kind of capture the essence of all different blockchains in one conversation because you can have you can have private blockchains, you can have hybrid blockchains, you can have permissioned or permissionless blockchains. And so some of what I'm going to say is a generalization that applies to some of this. But it's important to understand that there's many different forms that blockchains can take. But at the end of the day, the reason they're called blockchains is because they're basically blocks that are chained together. And that's really the single essence. When you think about the distributed ledger technology, you think about what a ledger is, it's just a way of recording transactions. And the way historically that's worked is you'd have a paper book, you'd fill out the transaction on each line, and when you get to the bottom of the page, you turn the page. Well, think about blocks as analogous to a page, right? So when you fill a block, you're done with that block, right? So you have a certain number of transactions you put into a block. And what happens, where the magic is in the technology behind this, is that once you complete a block, you create a hash value, which is just you run an algorithm, it generates a unique number based on the unique contents of that block, and that value gets written to the next block. And it's that writing of the value of block A to block B is what chains the blocks together, right? So, people struggle to understand blockchain. And in the very essence, that's a big part of it right there is one part. The other kind of bigger, aspect, if you look at how blockchain works, you guys have probably seen this graphic on the internet, but basically when someone requests a transaction, the transaction gets broadcast to the network, and there is different blockchains work different ways, different protocols for validating transactions, but the transaction gets broadcast to the network, and according to the transaction protocol for that blockchain, if the transaction is validated, then it gets written to the block. It gets, when the block gets filled, it gets filled, and you write the hash to the next value, and this gets chained together, and you form a chain of blocks. And that the other thing that's important is that chain of blocks then typically gets replicated multiple times to all the nodes in the network. So you have multiple copies of the same database. So it's very, we use this term immutable, and we were talking about how, well, maybe it's not a great term because with quantum computing you could probably, do some changing and stuff. But for the most part, today, it's largely immutable, because in order to change values of transactions that have already been recorded to blocks, you have to not only change the value and then change the hashes, but you have to do that for multiple databases. So it's very hard to change that at this point. So when you look at on the right here, the different characteristics, you hear a lot of these terms thrown around pretty frequently with blockchain, and sometimes these terms are clear, sometimes they're not. I'll go through them real quick. So you hear decentralized. That just means that there's not a single entity that's typically controlling it. It's distributed verification of the transactions. Distributed ledger just means there's multiple copies, different nodes. Peer-to-peer transactions. Generally, the network is validating the transaction, but I'm transacting directly with somebody else. We're not going through Visa networks or other payment networks and third-party payment providers. It's primarily end-to-end transaction peer-to-peer with validation in the middle. You use cryptography for securing the transactions. Arguably, it's immutable. The transactions are generally pseudonymous, which means they're not really anonymous, but they're not really public, right? So again, the way these typically work is that you're transacting through your wallet. There's a wallet ID, and if people don't know who is behind a wallet, then what you see on the blockchain, if you use any of the analytic tools, you'll see a wallet identifier, and you'll see a transaction, and X Bitcoins went into or went out of that wallet, and you'll see the wallet ID of who the other party was. But you don't necessarily know who the entity was. But with tools, you can track that, and that's how the government and others are tracking this. So that's what the term pseudonymous means. The other thing that's interesting, and we didn't really talk about this much, and we're not seeing a lot of this right now, but it's very highly divisible, right? So what that means is, like, you don't have to spend one Bitcoin. Whereas today, if you have $1, you can't rip it in half and give someone half of it, but you can spend fractions of a Bitcoin down to like 8 decimal places. So, if it became desirable to do super micro transactions, you could actually do that with cryptocurrency. Very hard to do it with real currency. And because all these transactions get written to the blockchain and they're always there, then you have a very highly auditable trail of transactions for situations where that's relevant, whether it's a regulated industry or supply chain or other situations where that's a desirable feature. So when you think about how blockchain technology is different at a high level, really some of the central things are trust and transparency, right? So you're trusting the network, you're not trusting entities to validate transactions. So you're putting your trust in the protocol and the nodes to make sure the transactions are validated and recorded, and that data is visible. And that's really what distinguishes it, in my mind, from a lot of the commercial databases. We have a single entity that controls it, they control all the data, they have access to it, and most other people don't. And why is that important? Anyone remember Enron? What led to that? Lack of transparency. They had all these transactions that the regulators didn't know about. Didn't turn out so well. Same thing with 2008 with Lehman Brothers. Everyone had their CDOs, right? And everyone had their asset-backed securities that were collateralized by someone else's asset-backed securities that were cross-collateralized. There was no collateralization. That's why they all went down, right? So the lack of transparency, we take it for granted on a day-to-day basis, but the major catastrophes, if you look back, in a large part stem from entities that should not have been trusted and a lack of transparency, which enabled them to leverage that lack of trust, or the fact that they were trusted. And so if we look forward today, right, there's a lot of government investigations going on of some of these big companies that have a lot of data because of lack of trust, lack of transparency, different algorithms about what's being shown to people. We all know the issues. I'm not trying to slam these companies, but I think that the reason I think that blockchain will be useful in many instances is where you want to have trust and transparency, it's a very good technology. It's not going to replace everything, but it has useful purposes. We talked about smart contracts. I'll go through this kind of quickly. They're not contracts necessarily. They can be. We'll talk about that in a second. I define them as really the operational terms of a business agreement. And that agreement can be a written agreement between parties where you're codifying the terms in code, the operational terms, or in some cases, if the parties agree, you can have a smart contract that's intended to be kind of a standalone we're going to let this contract run and we're going to be bound by the results. Now, whether that's legally binding, we can come back to that. But you have this range of options of what it really is. But at the end of the day, what the code of a smart contract is doing, it's executing business terms that parties agree on. And it's typically done through what's called conditional logic or if-then logic. And it's basically, it's a program that's running or a script that's getting data input from different oracles, or sometimes called that, different data sources. And if certain conditions occur, then it's programmed to do something. That's the then, right? That's the output. And at the end of that, and you can cascade smart contracts where you can have the output of one can be, feed into the input of another one. The thing that I think that's interesting from a technology perspective and a legal perspective with smart contracts versus something like automatic bill payment, right? If you think about automatic bill pay, it's like a smart contract, except it's not run on a blockchain. And it's really just, you sign an agreement with a service provider that if you have a recurring loan payment, that they can take money out of your account on the first day of the month for that amount. And there's going to be code that actually runs and that will make sure that happens, right? That's not a smart contract. That's an automated process. The things that are different with smart contracts are, in addition to it being done on a blockchain, is that one of the things you can do with smart contracts is you can have a self-enforcement remedy programmed into the code. And the way you do that, I think it was mentioned, is through, you can have either a form of digital escrow, or you can have something where if I have a loan with you and I breach it, there can be something in the code that will enforce that. So if there's digital title to something, that title can be digitally transferred. If there's a token that represents title, that token can be passed to you if I default, for example. You don't have to go to a court, get a judgment. You don't have to enforce a judgment. Basically, the contract executes that. So that to me, I think, is the interesting part of smart contracts. A lot of the other ones that are talked about is just like bill pay, right? It's an automated process, which is useful, but not necessarily different. So we think about, in the terms of smart contracts, you have this idea of trusted transactions. And an example that people use a lot is the vending machine. And it's not a smart contract, but the analogy is that, when you go to a vending machine, you don't have a written agreement. You don't have a contract. But you put your dollar in, trusting that when you push the button, you're going to get your Dr. Pepper. Right? And it's not a written agreement, it's not a contract, but that's the paradigm of when you take a smart contract and you put it on a blockchain and you have code, as a party, you're expecting some outcome that you believe is going to happen. And in situations where you trust for that to happen and you're willing to accept the consequences, smart contracts make sense. We're seeing a lot of experimentation with smart contracts right now. I wouldn't say it's going to be wide-scale commercial use on big transactions for some time, but I think there's a lot of interest and a lot of potential. For people who want to dig into this even further, there's a good paper written that's referenced here that kind of really breaks down more from a legal perspective what smart contracts are. I'm going to skip over that. One example, I mentioned this, I'll go through this quickly, but if you have a car loan, just think about, and again, this sounds theoretical, but this is all can be done right now. If you have a car loan that's implemented via blockchain with tokenized collateral, so let's say we had cars that instead of having paper title, you have a digital token that represents ownership. And let's say even further that the car itself has a smart contract, has a wallet in the car. And if you own a token, right, you have access to the car. So that's your key, essentially. If you have possession of the token that works with the wallet, will read it, you can access the car, you can drive it. The moment you default and you don't cure, and you now have a situation where there's going to be a repossession, right? How can that happen in the blockchain world? Is instead of going to court and getting a judgment, and then getting Dog the Bounty Hunter to come do the repossession, right, and having to take it to the repo yard, right? What you can do with blockchain is that if the car itself is self-driving and the lender now has the token, they can program the car to go to their own lot, right? You don't need judges, juries, or lawyers to implement that. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, there's a lot of work being done on smart contracts right now to create like templates of code and contract provisions that are being drafted. Here's just some of the projects that are out there right now. Okay, so that's a real quick background and summary and high-level overview of the currencies and blockchain. Now we're going to talk the legal and regulatory issues, which is kind of the heart of our discussion here and the part that is a little more uncertain. So let me ask you this. How are cryptocurrency and tokens classified? Are they securities? Are they commodities? Are they property? Are they money? Yes. The answer is, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And if you look at the different agencies, the SEC has exerted jurisdiction saying they're securities, at least in some cases. CFTC says it's a commodity. IRS says it's property and taxable as such. And the FinCEN said it's money and is subject to the money transmitter laws and the Bank Secrecy Act. So we have this hodgepodge of regulation right now, and as part of what's creating some of the challenges. To look at it a little bit deeper, and there was some good conversation on the last panel on some of the specifics that are happening, so I'm going to keep this kind of more high level. But from the SEC perspective, they have said that most tokens they've seen are securities. Right? They've said Bitcoin is not, Ether probably is not now, may have been, but it's not. But beyond that, they've largely said that most tokens are securities, at least in their view. And so they're within their jurisdiction, they enforce the securities laws. And if you have an item that's a security that's traded on an exchange, then you have a securities exchange that's subject to those rules as well. The CFTC has said that cryptocurrency, they've classified it largely as a commodity, and they regulate the derivative options in future markets and look for the trading activity and things like that. And FinCEN, as many of you probably know, it's under the Department of Treasury, and they could administer the Bank Secrecy Act, dealing with anti-money laundering, know your customer, and no terrorist financing and all that money laundering stuff. And they've issued guidance, and they've basically said that the regulations that exist apply to convertible virtual currency, which they deem most of this to be. So just to look at that a little bit deeper, I mean, there's been a lot written, so I've just kind of given some samples here. But one of the first kind of pronouncements that the SEC made as far as guidance, they issued what's called the DAO report. There was an entity called the DAO. It is a digital autonomous entity. It was kind of essentially like a smart contract-driven venture fund that operated on a blockchain, and it got hacked and things ended badly. And they determined that was it was subject to securities law. They didn't register. They really didn't take any action. They kind of used it as a kind of a poster child. They issued guidance and said, here's how we're interpreting cryptocurrency and how securities laws apply. They updated that more recently with in April with their framework for investment contract analysis, which we'll talk about. Most of what's happened so far in the U.S. at the federal level has been not really new federal law, but it's been agencies providing guidance on how the existing law applies. And we'll come back to that in a second. So I was covering the SEC before we lost power here. So as most of you are probably painfully aware at this point, you've heard of the Howey test, right? And so the key issue that they look at in assessing ICOs and other activities, whether it's security or whether it meets the Howey test, there's 4 components here. Is there investment of money? Is there common enterprise? Is there expectation of profit? And is that profit derived from the effort of others? If you meet those 4, it's a security. And the SEC has said that most tokens meet that definition. I think there's some interesting things that haven't been addressed. I think we talked about NFTs and stable coins a bit. With non-fungible tokens, again, there's arguments that people have put forth. These haven't been really tested in court that I'm aware of, and really the SEC hasn't really issued guidance. But I think you can look at NFTs potentially differently than fungible tokens. I think arguably, if you have a unique asset, the common enterprise, there may be situations where the common enterprise test is not met. It can still be there's common enterprise depending on other factors, but you don't have a pooling of interest typically with NFTs. And depending on, even if you have profits, the profit may be, derived from market scarcity versus the effort of others. So you have situations where you could have NFTs that aren't securities. I haven't really seen the SEC address it. Stable coins, same thing. Not same thing, but if it's truly stable in value, arguably there's not an expectation of profit, right? If you're buying something for $1 with the expectation it's going to be still worth $1, it may not meet the definition of the security under an investment contract, but it may still be a security under other parts of it. I mean, everyone is focused on the investment contract part. That's what the SEC has applied, but there's other parts to the definition of security under the securities laws. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how they deal with stable coins. CFTC, they've exerted jurisdiction, and they're focused on the currencies and the trading activities largely. Skip over that just in the interest of time. One of the interesting things that the CFTC chairman said, and this is not official gospel, but this was his view, and it's really interesting for developers, you should think about this, is that smart contract developers, that if you could be held liable for aiding and abetting violations of CFTC rules if you create a smart contract and it's reasonably foreseeable that it'll be used in a way that violates the law. So why is that important? How does it manifest itself? I can't tell you the number of panels I've been on and people will raise hands and say, well, I'm not really subject, I'm just creating a smart contract, but I'm not running it after that. I'm just kind of, that's the situation they're trying to get at here, right? So someone is creating the contract. If it's you and it's operating in a decentralized exchange, the fact that you're not pushing buttons and you may still be liable, at least according to their interpretation. So I think that's just something to be aware of, and I think that's a interesting case that'll be brought one of these days, and we'll see what actually happens and whether it's enforceable. FinCEN, so they've issued guidance, I think pretty clear. They came out, I think in 2013, they issued guidance on convertible virtual currency, and they updated it recently. It's not really very remarkable. I mean, they're saying that basically the rules apply to convertible virtual currency and different entities that participate, and they provide a definition of the activities that are covered. And the ramifications are, if you're a money transmitter, then you have to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act at the federal level. And the other thing that's important, and we see this all the time, is that people will try to label themselves as doing something like, here's the label of what we're doing. And they've made it clear in the other agencies, they don't care about labels. They don't care what you call yourself. You can say a utility token. Like, labels don't matter. They're going to look at the facts and the circumstances. They're going to look at what's actually happening, and they're going to apply their test to the facts, not your characterization of them. On the legal side of smart contracts, now we touched on this in the last panel, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about because, again, I think the term smart contract's a terrible term. It's confusing. And I think the thing that's interesting is that there really is a range of things that people are calling smart contracts. And here's just a high-level example. You can have theoretically a contract that's entirely written in code, all the way through a traditional natural language contract that has some code mechanism that's implementing some portion of it, and you can have different things in between. And so I think it's kind of confusing to use the term smart contract. I think someone said they're neither smart nor contracts, and that may be right, but they also could be contracts in certain circumstances. So how do we deal with this from a legal perspective? And I think, again, this is there's not been a lot of cases on this. So this is just my view on kind of how we're going to look at it, but basically contract law is going to apply. So what are some of the key issues? So one of the primary issues you think about is there a contract? Was a contract formed? And you look at contract formation principles. Who are the parties? So one of the things that's interesting when you start looking at digital autonomous organizations, or you look at decentralized organizations, I mean, is there really an entity there, right? And in some cases, you actually, when you think about like the vending machine examples, where I think it's good, you're not really transacting with a party per se. Someone may own the vending machine, but you're not really entering into a contract per se with that entity. There may be situations where that's an issue. Is there mutual assent? I think if both parties commit to having a contract, a smart contract or the code govern their activity, arguably there's mutual assent. There's a lot of principles around electronic contract formation that's pretty well established. So I think if you adhere to those principles, you can have a valid contract. So then you get on to issues like performance and execution. And what happens if there's a mistake? So the mistake can manifest itself in different ways. So the mistake can happen because the code doesn't implement the actual intent of the parties. You could have the code that actually operates the way it's intended to, but the data sources give you bad data, right? Or variations on that. So what happens if there's a mistake? So this is I think is going to be an issue that it will arise. There's no doubt that there's going to be some situation where this arises, and I think this really depends on, do you have a written agreement that goes along with the smart contract, or you just have code? And I think if there's a written agreement, and we worked on some of these, I mean, this is something you want to address. What happens if there's a mistake, right? Do you accept the outcome, which is something the parties could agree to? Probably not advisable. Depending on the circumstances, it may be. You need to think through what can go wrong and address it in the contract and figure out how you want to deal with these different scenarios. So I think that's kind of an interesting area. The other thing that's, people talk about smart contracts, and this is where, just a simple example, there's a lot of contractual provisions that are common in business agreements that you really can't execute in code. So, it's common to see a provision that says that a party will use commercially reasonable efforts to do X. How do you implement in code commercially reasonable efforts, right? It's kind of hard to do that. So, I think for these reasons, for most significant business contracts that are using some form of smart contract knowledge, you're going to have a written agreement. I think it's kind of crazy not to, right? So these are some of the things you want to deal with. And then I think the other part that's interesting that I alluded to earlier is what happens if there's breach of a contract. And I think the thing I mentioned earlier that's interesting is you can have self-enforcement remedies in a contract. And I think that for the most part, if you breach a contract and there's some digital escrow that gets released and you lose some value as a result of that, and you run to court and tell a judge, hey, I want this undone because I really didn't mean that, or I didn't want that result. I mean, if you have a well-drafted contract and the parties agree to it and it's not in violation of law or other conditions, I think a court will typically uphold that in most situations. So I think it comes back again. I think drafting a properly enforceable contract, including the remedy provision, even if it's an automated remedy, I think is going to be an area that's interesting. And then we touched on jurisdiction. I mean, this is just going to be a mess for a long time. You can shut down nodes in the U.S., but you're not going to shut down necessarily a blockchain that's you may not be able to operate nodes in the U.S., for example. But I think that when you execute a smart contract on a blockchain, it's running on every node. So even if you shut down some nodes, the contract's not going to go away. So there's what can a judge do, or what will they want to do, and then there's the practical effect of what can they do from a practical perspective. I think that's going to be an interesting area. These are just some of the e-contract laws. So we touched on states previously. Again, most of the states that are addressing blockchain, these have been very favorable laws. There's been a couple of states that have been very active. Wyoming, they're trying to create a very crypto-friendly environment. They're waiving state tax on gains of cryptocurrency, and there's other things that they're doing there. But so this has been kind of good. Delaware, I think it was mentioned earlier, they passed a law that you can do corporate records and other corporate activity on a blockchain. New York, bit license, kind of onerous. There's a link here if anyone's interested. There's a link to a place that's tracking kind of the different state laws relating to blockchain. Just briefly touch on patents. As a kind of patent attorney for a long time, I can't not touch on this. So we see a lot of people, a mix of what's happening with patents in the space. There's not a lot of big, huge commercial activity yet, so people are just trying to get stuff out there, get it working, get people using it. And some companies are not really focused as much on patents. We're seeing an uptick in patents now because you're seeing a lot of the bigger players come in. We're seeing more activity. And I think there's a lot of confusion around what's patentable in the blockchain space. I can tell you what's not patentable. If you take something that's been done before and say, I'm putting it on a blockchain, that's not going to be patentable, right? There has to be something different there, some unique functionality or some aspects of what you're doing on blockchain that you're getting a benefit that you couldn't get using a traditional database or otherwise. That's going to be a challenge. And if you're really just trying to claim a business process on the blockchain, you're going to probably have a problem under 101 with the subject matter eligibility. The other issue that's interesting is infringement, right? We haven't really had too many patent infringement cases in this space yet, but who is going to be infringing, and which nodes can you go after, which node operators? There's a jurisdictional impact of patents, and U.S. patent will cover anyone who makes, uses, sells something in the U.S. But if someone's running a node in Germany, your patent's not going to be effective against them. So you want to factor that in your kind of patent strategy. Here's just some quick numbers on kind of some of the players that are active in the space. But a lot of the early blockchain patents were primarily in the fintech space, and I'd say largely defensive patents. But we're seeing kind of an uptick across the board in different kind of the fundamental technologies that are enabling blockchain and different applications across different industries. There's a question about global trends. So, I think that this is, kind of a challenging area because, Switzerland, Japan, Malta, Singapore, there's various jurisdictions that have been very, I'd say, more prompt to act than the U.S. They've kind of created clarity. Doesn't mean they're not regulating things, but they've kind of made it pretty clear, and they've made it, more, I'd say, business friendly. And so we're seeing, I think the U.S. is kind of falling behind right now because of what's going on. And I think one of the things that's interesting is, with the Libra, the Facebook announcement, I mean, they set up the entity is in Geneva, so not in the U.S., right? I think it's because of this. So I think that's an issue that we need to deal with. So where do we go from here? I think that when you look at the regulatory approach to date, the U.S. federal law approach has been just regulatory guidance and enforcement, right? There hasn't been new federal laws. When you look at, kind of what's happening, it's like they're trying to stick a square peg in a round hole here. There's a lot of different things we've talked about cryptocurrency and distributed ledger technology compared to what's out there. And I think trying to take the existing regulations, to some extent it works, to some extent a security is a security, but there's also different characteristics here. And I think there needs to be some thought around that. And the states, same thing. I mean, do we really want state-by-state legislation? When you think about privacy law, money transmitter law, then having to comply with federal law and then 50 states is just a regulatory burden. And while I think the states are trying to be helpful right now, I think some of the laws they're passing are unnecessary. I think, to say that a smart contract's enforceable, well, if you can just show you meet the elements of a contract, it's going to be enforceable. You don't need a law that says that, right? They're not really giving you any greater guidance, but to the extent that some of the regulators, while I think they're trying to be helpful, there was a comment I think Chris made about the Uniform Law Committee. Like the states aren't all following that, so you're getting defined terms that are in some cases ill-informed, and it can create a problem down the road. And then you have the question of so should there be federal preemption in some of these areas? And there was a bill that was introduced and died and then was reintroduced called the Token Taxonomy Act, and it's attempting to address some of these issues. I don't know if it's going to pass, but it was introduced and reintroduced rather, and not much has happened yet. But essentially will exempt digital tokens from the definition of a security if it's passed as written. It will ensure that the CFTC and FTC still have jurisdiction. Nothing's going to waive that. It'll preempt certain state regulation of securities, which I think would be a good thing, but not fraud. So if there's consumer fraud, then the states can still protect their consumers. And there's various tax provisions, one of which I think is incredibly useful is that a crypto-to-crypto exchange would be like a 1031 exchange, like kind, not taxable, and a few others that are there. So what are some of the big things that are going on? So Bitfinex is been sued by the New York Attorney General, and I think some of you may be familiar with this. Is the kind of the Tether situation. Allegedly, Tether, there's $1 backing each dollar of Tether. That's come under question recently, and there's been some allegations by the AG that there's been some shenanigans, to use a legal term. Bitfinex basically says the money has not been lost, but in fact it's been seized and safeguarded. Seized by who? And safeguarded how? We'll see what's going to happen with that, and they're committed to fighting this gross overreach. So, if that one goes, we'll maybe get some further clarity. I think one of the other big cases right now is Kix, the Canadian company. They have the Kin coin. They've been going back and forth with the SEC for a bit here. They got a Wells notice, and basically the SEC sued them recently. And the core of the allegation is that they didn't register their token. The SEC says security, as they've said, everything is. And Kix, basically they've raised some funds and they say they're going to fight this, and they want to establish that what they're doing and that tokens are not necessarily securities. And here's some of the responses in the press release. They haven't really answered yet. But they're going to take on the SEC analysis of the Howey test, and if that goes the distance, maybe we'll get some guidance on that from the courts instead of just the SEC. So I want to just kind of walk you through this, right? I'm not going to give an answer to this, but think about this, right? So the Howey test, the elements are on the left. So let's say you're a real estate developer and you have a big plot of land and you want to sell off some lots to people, and you tell people, come in, buy a lot now. I'm going to build a community center and build some infrastructure, and if we build this community and more people come in, the housing prices will go up. You buy the lot with the expectation of profit, and if the developer is successful in doing what they're going to do, they're going to make some money, you're going to make some money. Okay, that's scenario one. Scenario two, you have a company building a blockchain-based platform that's going to offer some functionality. They offer tokens. You buy tokens early. The expectation is that you're going to have an increase in the value of those tokens if they build out the platform and they're successful in building a community. If they're successful, the developer is going to make some money by operating their platform. You're going to make some money by increasing the value of your tokens. Okay. Should those two scenarios be treated the same? Whether you think it's a security or not a security, should those scenarios be treated the same? How many people think yes? Not too many. How many people think no? How many don't care? All right. When you look at the parallels here, it's kind of striking, right? If you argue it this way, putting aside other potential facts. And there is, in fact, a case, that scenario in the middle, where there were individuals who bought lots, and the developer didn't do what they said they were going to do. They sued under securities law, and the court, a California court, found that those lots weren't a security. And a big part of the issue in that case was, A, there was no common interest because the lots were unique, and the second was that there was no contractual obligation for the developer to provide any of the services they said they would provide. So it might have been consumer fraud, but it wasn't a security because they didn't have a written agreement saying we're going to build this. And I think that's going to be an issue that gets raised in connection with these cases, is that, what's the difference between selling something to somebody, right? So, people bought Beanie Babies for a long time because they were going to go up in value, but there was no contractual obligation to keep selling Beanie Babies or do anything else. Those weren't securities. Right, and so I think where this line gets drawn. We were having this conversation before, and I think it's an interesting issue. And I think the SEC has said what they've said, but I think there's court cases that arguably could be used to persuade a court of other outcomes. So just in conclusion, I don't have time to go through these in great detail, but I think there's a lot of other interesting areas to really think about. So there's we talked about tokenization of almost everything, right? So one of the things that I'm talking with some friends at the World Bank, we did a program. They're actually looking at creating digital title systems, and for places where there aren't title systems, right? So replacing existing title systems that aren't broken may not be the best use of blockchain, but when you have places where people have houses or huts or whatever it is that are not a title system, they can't borrow against it because there's no title to collateralize. So there's some really interesting, I think, life-changing things that can happen with that kind of scenario. We're seeing a lot of tokenization of people refer to as illiquid assets, people selling fractional interest. So whether you have equity in your home and you don't want to take out a loan, you can sell a share of the future appreciation that can be resold or fractionalized, and part of it can be sold off. Identity management, blockchain, there's a lot of possibility for identity management solutions. One of the other things that kind of is almost the flip side of that is data privacy. So it's on a public blockchain, if you have exposure of who somebody is as opposed to just a wallet, it's really hard to comply with privacy laws. and particularly under GDPR with the right to be forgotten because of the immutability. If there's an association of transactions with an individual, how do you get rid of that from a blockchain, right? So that's part of why you probably need private blockchains for that piece of it, with personal control. And I also think that, we touched on earlier these DAOs, these digital autonomous organizations. I think it's really fascinating. You think about a situation where in the future you could have cars that are, like we mentioned before, that have a smart contract. They can be programmed just to go out and be like their own Uber. And basically you could have, that could be an entity that basically operates according to a set of smart contracts. And it could have tokens that are distributed that basically fund the initial purchase for the car. But after that, it's just spitting out revenue. And there's, it's just programmed to operate, right? I mean, what's the legal status of that? Right? And I don't know. I think that's going to be kind of interesting. I think that statement that the CFTC commissioner made, I mean, if you're creating those smart contracts and programming it, I think you're probably going to have some liability. But whether it's contractual liability or securities or otherwise, I think it's going to depend on the facts. But I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. So thank you.